This is our presentation on Medusa, created by Aiden Yoshida, me, Zachary Windish, and Chris Catahan. Uh, but to look at Medusa, we must understand her birth of a monster concept. The presentation will go into depth about Medusa's presence throughout the course of time, why her presence matters today in a modern society, and was she truly a monster? Um, the birth of a monster again. We must understand why Medusa was a monster, how she was born a monster, and told about discrepancies between stories told over time and how each has changed. There's two major stories that have been told with Medusa. Uh, the two major versions we'll be looking at is the Thyrgoni version from 730 to 700 BC, where it explains she was born into a family of three immortal sisters, with the father being the god Porcius, with the mother being the goddess Keto. They were brother and sister. These three sisters born were all Gorgon, which is basically a woman with monstrous traits who basically hate everything. They were all immortal with the exception of course, Medusa. Um, the other version of the story, the Metamorphosis version, describes Medusa as a mortal, beautiful maiden. She worked in the temple of Athena, which in order to work in the temple of Athena, you have to be virgin, because Athena is the goddess of virginity. The god of Poseidon saw this and decided to take advantage, with Poseidon and Athena being enemies towards each other, and to either have a love affair or violate Medusa in different stories. This, of course, enraged Athena that someone in her temple wasn't virgin, but instead of punishing Poseidon, she punished Medusa, turning Medusa into a weapon to use against Poseidon, giving her her classic locks of snake hair and her stony vision that she uses to turn people into stone. The end of Medusa. All these stories have one common ending about Medusa, that she was slain by Perseus. Each one varies, with the top three that we've chosen being her gaze was reflected back upon her with a shield from Perseus. She was killed while she slept, with her being beheaded, so she couldn't turn Perseus into stone if she was awake. And another version, being the final version we've chosen, with her being fought with a shield, so Perseus could walk up to her with the shield and not be able to see her and fight her. The intended lesson of this story has also changed since there are so many versions of this story. The two oldest versions of this story were a more masculine version of the story, explain about the major teachings of perseverance, bravery, and dignity, and to not fall for the tricks of feminine beauty. But the other version of the story, the now modern version of the story, is a more feminine version. Shows how the story has shown endless hardships brought upon her with patriarchal societal norms caused by a male society. Medusa's story from past to present has really changed. Medusa has had a major artistic influence across society from almost the late 1700 or 700 to 480 BC, with also a peak in the Renaissance era. And moving into the modern era, her art has been now used to convey more powerful messages. However, in the past 50 years, she has not just been limited to art, but rather many topics: politics, feminism, beauty, masculinity, even. But Medusa's art and architecture also has changed drastically from what people see her as in society itself. As you will see coming up, that each society has a very polar opposite idea of what Medusa could be. Medusa in the art and ancient art era. Medusa has played a major role in shaping elements of Roman and the Greek empires. She was displayed to be a evil to ward off all evils, the greatest evil of them all, thus making a cancellation effect, meaning she would actually protect you. But the Metropolitan Art Museum also kind of agrees with this, saying she represents a dangerous threat meant to deter other dangerous threats, an image of evil to repel all evil. Due to her thought ability to ward evil, she's commonly seen in the two empires of Greek and Roman. Seen on the right over here, we have a image of a cup with Medusa's face imprinted at the bottom to presumably protect drinkers from drinking evil spirits. The next one on the right of it is a pendant used by women, men, and commonly legionaries and Greek soldiers, which with the most interesting concept was that the people they were fighting were actually completely evil, which, big surprise, and they would use this pendant to ward off any evil they were fighting. The one on the bottom left is a roof tile taken off a Roman house or a Greek house, which is presumably also to protect the user's house from evil spirits. They also use this face on doorknobs on the homes. But the next one after this is a very, very interesting one. It's a protector on top of a vase you would put to protect dust from getting in it. But the interesting about this is the face on it. See, it still has its snake-like hair, but it now has two large beady eyes, protruding teeth coming out of the front, and a large beard now on the front, which is something very important to remember as going on. Even though this is the older version, it is still kind of prevalent. Medusa in art in the modern era. Her art in the modern era has been used to now convey powerful messages by feminists, and of course, as stated earlier, politics, feminist, masculinity, and everything else, which we will see now. So, the beauty of Medusa has been a staple of her legend, with now in the modern era us using her beauty and likeness to portray many things from beauty products and anything else that you believe to be beautiful a lot. But here we can see Medusa, or Rihanna, posed as Medusa with her Medusa-like hairstyle, with the snake coming across her and the different eye color to show a stony-like appearance as Medusa. But the common thing upon all of these is they don't see her as actually a monster, but rather something else of a beautiful, not monster in the way. Political use of Medusa. So not all sides of society today still agree Medusa isn't a monster. We have now seen in the past 10 years in the 2016 election that there is a political image of Trump holding up the head of Hillary Clinton, or Perseus holding up the head of Medusa, which is what it's meant to be. And then there is a text across the top that says Triumph, which is a clever play on the very beginning lessons, which was perseverance, which was supposed to be Trump persevering through the 2016 election. But this hasn't been the first time we've seen Medusa used in a political aspect either. We've seen it with past female figures as Margaret Thatcher and Angela Merkel. But feminist and Medusa have very strong ties now. Medusa has become a very prevalent image in the late 70s, with her being used in an image of showing women being put down by men and problems of others. This statue is a great example, with the statue being in New York City, created by Luciano Gabretti in 2008, depicting Medusa holding the head of Perseus, which was, of course, the opposite roles. The statue was created for the Me Too movement, which is a moral to represent female rage inside society. But feminist and Medusa. Feminist use of Medusa is far from over, but this is another small, greater example of how Medusa's past appearance can now display problems in the future that we have with feminism, masculinity, and all that stuff with the patriarchal society. The original image of Medusa that I talked about earlier, with her with the beard, the large beady eyes, and the snake-like nose, shows that this is a almost beauty standard, or a standard set for women, with another feminist, Isabella Panadero, in the article Off with Her Head, claims, "A woman that is beautiful and angry is no woman at all, something to be avoided at all costs and destroyed as soon as possible. Medusa was a powerful woman, demonized by the male narrative." We can also further back up what she said with going back to what we saw, how the large beady eyes represents evilness, how the beard is something that is not commonly seen as a woman or attractive in today's standards, or even the large protruding teeth as something weird or something that could be scary to someone. But there's also another side of this from the men, the masculinity side. However, they take the argument saying that this still applies in today's society, that Medusa is a problem, that she uses feminine beauty, that feminine beauty is still being weaponized against men, and that her story is still not far from over, that the stony gaze is almost a trap for men to fall into, the stony gaze being, of course, her beauty.
Another important facet of Medusa that is important to understand when answering the question, is she a monster or not, is her influence on various societies throughout history. And because of her popularity and consistent representation throughout history, Medusa has become one of the most influential monsters in today's society. As we have learned, she has appeared in various forms of political and artistic works throughout time. And even today, we see her depicted in various forms of media, such as movies, books, and even some video games. And this goes to show the timeless nature of her story and the themes that it contains. And then on the right here, we have a poster for the movie Clash of the Titans, which came out like somewhat recently in the year 2010, and it depicts Medusa's head being held high by a Roman warrior here. So, what is the importance of Medusa's story? Well, Medusa and her story have had a noticeable influence on various facets of society. This influence can be attributed to the powerful messages and themes that are present in her character and story throughout the years. These have held an incredible importance in various societies throughout history, whether it be ancient Greece or Roman societies or even modern America. She plays a pivotal role in representing the societal values of each. So, what is Medusa's importance in ancient societies? Medusa's story had originated in ancient Greek mythology, and the original story had depicted a young and beautiful woman who served as a priestess to the goddess Athena. And because of her role as a priestess, Medusa had devoted herself to a life of celibacy and prayer exclusive to the goddess Athena. When the god Poseidon had laid his eyes upon her, he had instantly become infatuated with her. But because of her devotion to Athena, Medusa had rejected his advances. And then this eventually led Poseidon to rape the young priestess, which broke Medusa's promise of celibacy. This angered the goddess Athena, and as punishment for her broken promise, she turned Medusa into a Gorgon. Her story, despite containing themes about masculinity, sexual assault, and rape, originally served ancient Greek societies as a cautionary tale about the hierarchy between mortals and gods. Many in ancient Greece believed Medusa to be in the wrong for rejecting the advances of the god Poseidon, and because she apparently believed herself to have any sort of power or say over the actions of a god, she had been punished with a perpetual existence as a monster. And this tale played an important role in instilling the theistic values of ancient Greece into their society and creating a culture of respect for their gods. So the importance of her death, perhaps the most popular story of Medusa in Greece is the story of her death at the hands of the hero Perseus. Perseus, at the tasking of King Polydectes, had set out to cut off the Gorgon Medusa's head. Because of Athena's favoring of Perseus and her loathing of Medusa, she had given Perseus a mirror of polished bronze. Perseus eventually used this mirror to reflect Medusa's stone gaze upon herself and then eventually cut off her head. Once again, this tale uses Medusa as a way to teach respect for the gods and solidify the hierarchy between mortals and gods in their society. And then on the right here is probably one of the most popular depictions of Medusa. It's a statue of Perseus holding up her severed head. So how is she important in other societies? Well, the Roman Empire had adopted various facets of ancient Greek culture, such as architecture, religion, and, of course, the story of Medusa. The Romans, however, utilized the story of Medusa in a very different way from the Greeks. The Romans had used the image of Medusa to ward off evil. Madeline Glennon with the Metropolitan Museum of Art states, the most common interpretation of Medusa suggests she is a patriarchaic symbol used to protect from and ward off the negative, much like the modern evil eye. She represents a dangerous threat meant to deter other dangerous threats, an image of evil to repel evil. And then on the right here is an amulet with Medusa's face carved in it, which was found on the body of a Roman soldier. importance in other societies continued. The Romans had used the idea of her as a way to ward off evil in various forms of art and architecture. Many Romans had carved the image of her into door handles, furniture, and buildings to protect themselves from evil. Even some Roman soldiers had worn pendants, much like the one that was depicted in the previous slide, of her face in order to protect them in battle. Her face has even appeared in various vases and sculptures that have been recovered from ancient Roman societies. Clearly, Medusa was an important figure in ancient Rome, and her role as a repellent for evil spirits was an important part of Roman culture. And then on the right here is an ancient depiction of Medusa present in the National Museum of Rome. Importance in understanding ancient societies. Since Medusa has played such an important part in the cultures of ancient societies, she can be an important tool in understanding the greater opinions and beliefs of these societies. The stories of Medusa prevalent in ancient Greece give us a better understanding of the importance of gods in their culture. Medusa's origins are rooted in her defiance of a god, and because of this defiance, she is punished with an unwanted transformation and eventually her death. This illustrates the cultural hierarchy of gods and mortals in ancient Greece and how they believe gods to be superior. And then, in importance in understanding women's roles. Her story can also be important in understanding how ancient Greek civilizations viewed women. As previously mentioned, the story of Medusa included her being sexually abused by the god Poseidon, yet despite this, she was the one who got punished, and not the perpetuator of this crime. This reflects the disrespect that these societies had towards women, and the National Geographic states that in these societies, women were kept out of the public sphere, denied citizenship, and held no legal or political standing. And then at the bottom right here is a depiction of the everyday lives of women. So how is she important in today's society? Well, Medusa's role in society has shifted massively from her role in the past. As previously discussed, ancient societies used her as a representation of something to be detested and looked down upon. She was often depicted as ugly and monstrous. As society has evolved, however, Medusa has become a symbol of power, independence, and inspiration. Not only has she become a symbol of power, but she has also become a symbol of beauty and elegance, which is a far cry from her earlier depictions as a grotesque and monstrous figure. Medusa's importance in beauty. As society has evolved, so has the image of Medusa. More modern depictions of Medusa depict her with great beauty and sex appeal. Because of this, she has become one of the many symbols of beauty in today's society. Many models and celebrities have implemented the image of Medusa in their various works, and various modern art also depicts Medusa in this fashion, and the shift in her appearance has led her to become a symbol of women's empowerment. And then on the right here, we have a model who is dressed up like Medusa in one of her self-portraits. Medusa's importance in feminism. Perhaps Medusa's most important effect on today's society is her influence on feminism. Her monstrous nature and gaze that turns the beholder into stone represents the dangers that female sexuality can pose to the male-dominant society that has persisted throughout history. This, combined with the beauty that she is often described as possessing, has led her to become a symbol for women's empowerment, and her image has been used as a representation for various women's issues. Her usage in various pro-feminist art, media, and movements have inspired many around the world to stand up to the patriarchal society and have caused many social changes. And on the right here is a tattoo of Medusa that is often worn by sexual assault survivors, which we'll get into later. Petrifying the patriarchy. With Medusa's rise as a feminist symbol, she has naturally become an anti-patriarchal symbol. These feminist groups have reversed the themes of the original story to go against its patriarchal origin. Medusa's rape at the hands of Poseidon and the failure to punish the perpetrator has often been used as a symbolic event to represent the societal injustices that have favored the masculine members of society. The symbolic reversal of the origin story has helped solidify the image of Medusa as a symbol of various anti-patriarchal movements. Medusa and empowerment. Medusa's pro-feminist and anti-patriarchal symbol has extended to various social movements. One of these movements, the #MeToo movement, aims to bring awareness to sexual abuse and assault against women and has utilized Medusa as a symbol for their campaign. The statue, depicted on the right, not the left, had gone viral after a woman had posted it on her social media with the caption #MeToo. The statue depicts Medusa carrying the severed head of Perseus, which is a reversal of the original story's events. This has become symbolic of women's empowerment, and in the case of the #MeToo movement, the empowerment of sexual assault victims. So recap, Medusa's importance in society. With her extreme popularity and influence throughout society, it is fair to say that Medusa is an extremely important figure in society. Her story and various depictions of her in many different societies have had a great impact on their culture, and this can still be seen in today's society. Historically, she has been depicted as a monstrous being, whose demonization reflects these ancient civilizations' poor views of women. However, in modern society, she has become a symbol for social change, especially regarding women's issues. She and her fictional, artistic, and symbolic representations throughout history have become a catalyst for many cultural characteristics in society. And now that we understand her importance in society, I believe that we can answer the question, is she a monster or not?
So, in thinking about this presentation of the question, is Medusa a monster? I read both. The first thing I did is that I first read both the theogony of how she was already a monster her whole life and how her entire family is monstrous, and I took an examination or look at what Ovid had to talk about in the Metamorphoses, which was written much later than what was in the theogony, and I ultimately came to the conclusion that she isn't a monster because in that story specifically, she was turned into a monster basically for something that she had no control over. Like, I think Poseidon essentially sexually assaulted her inside of the temple of Athena, and when Athena saw this, she was incensed, because earlier in the story, Medusa basically made a pledge to her saying, I will, be your loyal and faithful servant. I will dedicate my entire life to venerating and honoring your spirit, and I will basically spend the rest of my days just dedicated to you. Basically, Athena wanted to be... No, not Athena, sorry. Medusa. Medusa basically became a nun. Or a priestess. No, priestess is the correct term, sorry. Medusa essentially became a priestess, and because she broke the promise she made to Athena, Athena punishes her. And the way that Athena punishes her is that she takes away anything that Medusa values. So, for example, she essentially takes away Medusa's humanity. She basically turns her into a grotesque-looking creature, because in the story that Ovid wrote in the Metamorphoses, Medusa is described as a beautiful maiden, as a maiden that, any man would chase after her, every man, looked upon her and adored her for her beauty. And Athena essentially takes that back, takes that away from her. She basically gives her a grotesque-looking face, and she also takes away Medusa's beautiful locks of hair and instead replaces them with snakes. But this isn't all she does. Athena also basically gives her the ability to turn any man that looked her in the eye to stone. And essentially, as a result of this, Medusa now has to spend her time in isolation, knowing that, she can now, instead of, being a beautiful woman in public and basically reveling in that, ultimately she now has to live by herself, isolated, because she knows that she's gonna hurt other people if people stare at her. And ultimately, from this, she's essentially a victim in her own narrative. Ultimately, the monster in this story, at least in the story that Ovid wrote, is basically that the goddess Athena, and especially the god Poseidon, they're the true monsters of that story. And looking now, ultimately, essentially, you could even make the argument that Medusa was the victim of misogyny. She was turned into a Gorgon basically as a result of misogyny. Like, in the story that Ovid wrote, specifically in the Metamorphoses, there's no mention of Poseidon ever being punished. Like, none of the gods confront him or dare challenge him of, like, what he did to her. And what I also found especially interesting is the fact that Athena, she doesn't there's no mention of her even thinking about, like, who's responsible. Like, there's no, like, passage or, like, mention of her saying, okay, so Poseidon is sexually assaulting Medusa in the temple. Who's to blame? Should I blame the more powerful god that has more control over me, even though I have equal power and just as much power as he does, and there's a chance that he might get back at me? Or should I blame the priestess who made a promise to me, basically stating that she will pledge her life to me and only to me, and that she will remain celibate her whole life? I'm gonna punish the priestess because she basically broke her promise to me. So essentially that's what ended up happening. And also what's also interesting too is that part of the reason why Athena made the decision that she did is because at the time misogyny ruled. Even the gods themselves at times showed misogynistic tendencies. And also within this, although men are valued more than women, at least the women that they deem as the exception, such as Athena, Hera, the goddess like Diana, like those goddesses, they're essentially, while they are powerful, they still technically play into the system in part because of the power it gives them. And in a way, as a woman who's in a misogynistic system, you want to keep as much power as you have, especially to be taken seriously. And we can see that's probably what Athena did. Like, because she knows if she sides with Medusa, that Poseidon might do something to her. He might not, like, explicitly threaten her, saying, like, why did you side with that mortal woman? Like, but I think with what Athena's trying to struggle with is ultimately that she's in it too, and perhaps, who knows, maybe she isn't even aware that she's even in a misogynistic, patriarchal system in the first place. Who knows? Like, these stories were written, like, thousands of years ago, and even, like, then, like, the authors probably still had questions to struggle with. So, what's so significant of the fact that she isn't a monster? Or, better yet, the question, like, what's her significance then versus now? I would argue that, like, I think because at least the tale in Ovid, which was the tale that seemed to have more an effect on how Medusa is viewed today, I would say that, like, what's the most pressing about that is the way that the sexual assault is described in the story. And in the story, the fact that Medusa is explicitly punished in the story and not Poseidon, I think goes to show that, like, the Greeks, like, they said, like, do not, like, mess, like, with the gods, and that the gods are ultimately, they're the more powerful ones running the show compared to the mortals. And because, like, this was one of the first tales to include something like sexual assault, and mind you, though, also, these are tales that were also told to children, because I don't think there was such thing as a children's market back then. Good to note. Is that, like, it also taught kids at a young age that, like, maybe at times sexual assault was, yikes, maybe it's meant to be in a way which is very disgusting today. Like, and even to, like, the idea of misogyny throughout, like, Medusa's tales, both how she turned into a Gorgon as well as her death, the fact that both the important men in her stories, so Poseidon, the man that assaults her, and Perseus, who kills her, the fact that they're not punished in the end, I think goes to show that, like, essentially that women are not as powerful as men. And even, I think, Perseus, the fact that he's hailed as a hero for killing her, instead of being seen as like a murderer, because that's essentially what he did. He essentially committed murder. And that murder, because Medusa wasn't considered a person anymore, was okay, is because at that point, like, the Greeks saw her as someone to be feared. And as a result of that, like, they lauded him, and he was dignified and valued. And I think even Athena plays a role in this as well. Like, she takes Medusa's severed head and uses it as a shield. And that's also why the Romans, I think, used her as the sort of like a protective symbol. Like, think of like things like the evil eye, or like to ward off evil, like basically using her head as this fearsome beast in order to protect like the certain space or the home or the person. I think also something that's significant too is that a lot of the tale of the assault of Medusa reminded me a lot of like the Harvey Weinstein scandals, in which this powerful man, Harvey Weinstein, was able to get away with sexual assault for so long. Almost reminding me a lot of like the way that like Poseidon, and how he was a very powerful god, and he was able to get away with essentially like dooming Medusa to like a life of being a monster, of being like seen as like the other. And the fact that we still struggle today with things, although we do struggle with it, but also we have made some inroads in terms of our progress. So there's Me Too. Like, thankfully, like, we're not in the days of Medusa where sexual assault is like seen as something as like, oh, like how tragic, like, oh, maybe it's your fault. Thankfully today, like, we actually take victims seriously compared to today. And thankfully that should be a lesson to us all, is that while these tales, while they do merit some value and have a moral component to them, we should be aware that these tales took place in an era where the values that we have now, they weren't thought of, or they weren't held back then.